Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order when you check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Sports Pictorium Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. If he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL helmet poster. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1.
He was called the Mozart of Basketball, and no matter what they asked him to do, no matter how they asked him to change his style of play, the Mozart of Basketball adapted. No one worked harder. No one spent more time practicing his craft, and no one had more passion for the game. There might have been basketball players who did as much to be the best they can, to realize their potential. But you'd be very, and I mean very, hard-pressed to find someone who loved the game more and worked at it more than Drazen Petrovic. And next, on Sports Forgotten Heroes, we're going to talk about the career of the Mozart of Basketball, Drazen Petrovic.
This is Sports Forgotten Heroes, a tribute to the stars who shaped the games we love to watch and the games we love to play. Stars who provided us with many thrills, but when their time was up, they faded away. We'll take a look back at their spectacular careers, their moments of fame, even if it was just for one season or just one game. And now, here's your host, Warren Rogan.
Hello and welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes. Thanks for joining. Today, we're going to take a look back at the tragic story of a basketball player whom many thought was on the road to superstardom, Drazen Petrovic. Back in the late 1980s and early 1990s, Drazen was making a name for himself in the NBA. He was already very well known in the world of international basketball, but he knew to be considered among the most elite players in the world, you needed to establish yourself as a star in the NBA. So he left Europe and joined the Portland Trailblazers. It didn't go as well as he had hoped it would. After spending just over a year with the Blazers, Portland obliged and sent Drazen packing to the New Jersey Nets when Drazen had requested a trade. Again, it didn't go as he had hoped it would go, and he came very close to quitting and going back home. However, after one season with the Nets, New Jersey parted ways with its coach, Bill Fitch, and hired Chuck Daly. Now, Daly was a fan of Drazen's. He knew just how good he was when it came to playing internationally, and Daly took the reins off Petrovic, and suddenly Drazen became a star. And we're going to get into all of it with my guest today, Todd Spehr, who wrote the book, The Mozart of Basketball. Now, a few months ago, when I was planning out episodes of Sports Forgotten Heroes, I got to thinking about Drazen and what a great story he'd make for the podcast. So I went to work. I was able to track down Todd, and he was more than happy to join me for this episode of Sports Forgotten Heroes. Now, Drazen, like I said, I thought about doing a podcast about him a few months ago. A short time later, the horrific incident with Kobe Bryant, his daughter, and the 7 other passengers occurred. I want all of you to know that this podcast has nothing to do with that. It's just a very unfortunate coincidence. You see, in the 1992-93 season, Drazen had become the star of the Nets, a team on the rise. After the season, Drazen, by virtue of a few very interesting circumstances, traveled overseas for a vacation with an acquaintance. Drazen was a passenger in a car driving along the autobahn and was ultimately killed in a collision. A life taken way too soon. While we'll talk about what led to that accident, today we will mostly concentrate on his incredible passion for the game of basketball, his work ethic, how he dominated in his then home country of Yugoslavia, how he realized his goal of making it to the NBA, the disappointment that followed, and finally the thrill of becoming a star in the NBA. And of course, I'll touch on a whole lot more with Todd, the author of the book, The Mozart of Basketball. Now, a few notes about the recording for this show. Todd lives in Australia, and I decided to try something new. We did the interview via a computer connection, and it worked out well. However, the audio is a little tinny, but still very, very clear, and you won't have any trouble listening. Additionally, the interview took place at 9 a.m. on a Sunday in Australia, so you might hear a few very young voices in the background. Those are Todd's children, but again, it shouldn't cause any trouble at all. As for the book, The Mozart of Basketball, I want to thank the great people at Sports Publishing, an imprint of Sky House Publishing, for connecting me with Todd. In particular, Jason Katzman for all the help he provided. This book was published several years ago, but is a terrific read, and I encourage everyone listening to get a copy. It really goes into great detail about the phenomenal career of Drazen Petrovic. Also, as always, please spread the word and let your family and friends know about Sports Forgotten Heroes. This is my 78th episode, and it's still going strong. Follow Sports Forgotten Heroes on Twitter at SportsFHeroes. Look for Sports Forgotten Heroes on Instagram, the Sports Forgotten Heroes page on Facebook, or check out sportsfh.com. This is where you can find every episode I've done so far. Learn more about my guests, the forgotten stars, and links to more information about everyone I have talked about. And you can also click the comments area and send me suggestions or make comments about the podcast. Again, that's sportsfh.com. Also, please, if you listen on Apple Podcasts, give the podcast a 5-star rating, and if you can, write a great review. Thanks. Okay, now let's get to today's show about Drazen Petrovic with my guest, Todd Spehr. Todd, thanks so much for joining me on Sports Forgotten Heroes. Thrilled you could be with me.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me, Warren.
Great. Hey, where does your interest in Drazen Petrovic come from?
That's a good question, and it's something I've thought about often when I was writing the book. But I grew up a huge NBA fan and a lover of the history of the game. So I was always aware of Drazen's importance and where he sort of fit in the jigsaw puzzle. But I suppose the thing that propelled me to look into his life further actually came from a discussion I had with a scout at an Oklahoma City Thunder game in the 08-09 season. I was a credentialed member of the media at that point and had a discussion about Kevin Durant, as you do, and his ability to come off screens and shoot. And this particular scout said to me, Petrovic is the best I've seen at that. And I thought, wow, that's not a name that we hear enough of. I started investigating his life and thought the idea for a book would be great. But it sort of propelled from there. Then, of course, later on the film, Once Brothers came out. I'm not sure if you've seen it. The 30 for 30 came out, and that sort of brought Drazen to the forefront of people's minds a little bit in a historical sense. And by that time, I'd already started writing, so the pieces fell into place. But always been interested in his life, but really didn't know a lot about him other than his NBA career. And as it turned out, what a fascinating 28 years he had.
Oh, absolutely. What other interesting thing, where did you get the name the Mozart of Basketball?
Yeah, that's actually a nickname that was bestowed upon him by an Italian writer, Enrico Campagna. who I spoke to for the book. He saw something in Drazen at an early age that inspired him to give him the nickname, and just the way that he moved on the floor, also the way he thought. Drazen was a risk taker in Europe, especially on the fast break. He would do exciting things with the ball, and that's sort of where the nickname came from. And I just thought there's something special about a nickname for an athlete, if you can attach the two things. The thing is, Drazen wasn't known as Mozart when he played in the NBA, but he was known by everyone as the Mozart of basketball in Europe. And I thought it was important to tie, obviously, Europe to his story. So that just seemed like the right name for the book. And, that's, I think, an appropriate title for it.
It's a heck of a name, and in reading your book, The Mozart of Basketball, and how technical he was, how he broke down a game, how he practiced and dedicated his game to dedicated his life to the game of basketball. It certainly fits. Obviously, you needed to make contact with and interview so many people from his native Yugoslavia or Croatia. How did you connect with them, and how long did it take you to write the book?
To answer the latter part of your question, it was about a 4-year process. But the interview, it was tough because a lot of these things aren't available readily from just a Google search. So I made a big list of names to start with. And then as I researched, more names got added to the list. All these little pieces that fit into Drazen's story along the way. But oftentimes, I suppose, in a traditional way, when you would interview someone, you would ask them, hey, do you know this person? Or where could I find this person? The language barrier was difficult. Of the 80-plus people I interviewed, 60-plus were European. So, all the different languages mixed in. My wife is from Mexico, so she did some of the interviews, the people I spoke to in Spain when Drazen was with Real Madrid. But, you just try to build a list of contacts. You rely on other people to give you phone numbers. You call people at all hours of the day. You hear the term labour of love, and obviously you can relate. You have a podcast. It's a labour of love. When you dive into something, you don't want to dip your toe in. You want to go all the way in. So, I tried to speak to as many people, particularly for the European portion of his life, as I could. But it was tough. I'm not going to lie, and very proud of the people that I reached. And, of course, the ultimate reward was being able to correspond with his brother and his mother, which came at the back end of the project. So, a lot of work went into it, but it was very, very rewarding.
His NBA career, obviously, it was not a very long career, cut short by that horrific tragedy. But for those who might have never heard of Drazen or don't remember much about him, please tell us who Drazen Petrovic was and just how good he was becoming.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. So Drazen was drafted by Portland in 1986. He was only 22 years of age. He didn't come to the NBA until 1989, and at the time there was very few European players. In fact, there was only 2 prior to Drazen who had played in the NBA, and each had only lasted 1 year. I think to understand Drazen and where he fits in is to understand the NBA's perception of Europeans in the mid to late 1980s. And that was, we can't correspond with these players. How can we expect them to carry out an instruction on the floor? Also, are they as tough as us? Us meaning the American players, obviously the establishment. So Drazen came to Portland in 1989, and he did not just want to be a reserve. He didn't want to just be a player that played a little bit. He wanted to be a star, and I think that's what differentiates him from, say, Vlade Divac, Sarunas Marciulionis, Alexander Volkov, etc., who it was to come to the NBA, and that was that. Drazen wanted to be a star, and I think that's the main differentiation. As far as how good he was becoming, after Portland was tough, he didn't play much. Obviously, he was playing behind Clyde Drexler, but once he got traded to New Jersey, a trade which, mind you, he initiated through his agent, Warren Ligari, and that speaks to, his determination to be what he believed he should have been. He was averaged 20 a game in 1992, and then he averaged almost 23 a game in 93. He didn't make the All-Star team in 93, but he was All-NBA third team, so essentially one of the 15 best players in the world. So to go from not playing at all in Portland to being one of the 15 best players in the world speaks to sort of his rise. As to how good he was becoming, that's the question, isn't it? I think he was. There was more in store for Drazen, which makes the accident all that more cruel.
Sure. As far as playing basketball is concerned, his parents, I don't know if I have this right, Joel or Jolet or Hole?
Yoli,
okay.
There you go.
Bizerka? Bizica. They originally wanted Drazen and his older brother, Alexander, to play music, but neither showed a whole lot of interest, and they took every opportunity they could to skip music practice to get out on the court. In fact, at a very young age, Drazen, he was a little clever. He would loosen the strings on his guitar so his instructor would have to retighten and tune the guitar, which gave Drazen time to spend on the court instead of practicing the guitar. So talk about how Drazen's parents finally came around, and actually they might have been disappointed in the fact that their two boys didn't want to play music, but they loved basketball and they encouraged them to be the best they could. I mean, that says a lot that, well, we want you to play music, but if this is what you love, go out, do it, and be the best you can at it. And boy, wasn't Drazen clever the way he got out to practice with the guitar, loosening the strings?
That makes me smile, Warren, hearing that story. And, it's funny, all these little things you don't think about after, you write them or you research them, but that's exactly right. And it speaks to personality traits that were consistent throughout his life. That's a small measure of determination, to do something such as that. But, Drazen came from a middle-class family. His father was a local chief of police, and his mother worked in childcare and in the library system. So came from a solid family, and, expectations that his brother Artso and Drazen become something of themselves. But yes, you're absolutely right. Whatever they chose to pursue, the parents were going to support them, and that continues even to this day. But, Drazen was largely influenced by his brother. It was a different climate back then. You couldn't rely on television or media to pursue maybe an athlete as a idol. Drazen's first idol was his older brother, and that's what led him into basketball. And it was a very good combination. They were on the floor. They played together at the domestic level and also at the national level. But Drazen's determination from an early age was really unusual, not only for the family, but for anybody in that area, and it propelled him to great heights.
It sure did. Where did his love for the game come from? I mean, how big was basketball in his hometown? And I'm going to try to get this right. Sibenik?
Sibenik, yeah, very close.
Okay, Sibenik. And how dedicated to the game did he become? I mean, he had a real love for basketball. I mean, there aren't many people with that kind of passion for something like that.
Yeah, that's a good observation. And, that was a thing that was brought up to me often during the interview process was that Drazen was very regimented from an early age. There was a lot of structure to his workouts. I can even speak to myself. When I would play basketball as a kid, it would be, I'd go and shoot and, my imagination would take over. Drazen was very prepared. He would set up chairs. He would do drills. Everything had purpose. Everything had meaning. As far as his inspiration, as I mentioned, his brother was one, but the basketball in Yugoslavia was very, very strong in the 1970s. There was a player actually that played at Brigham Young who was also from Croatia. His name was Krešimir Ćosić, who is still regarded by some as the greatest European ever. And he was the measuring stick for basketball in Yugoslavia and also propelled them to, Olympic gold, European championships, world championships, etc. So basketball in Yugoslavia was very healthy. But as far as that inner drive, where that came from, nobody was able to tell me that. Drazen was just a motivated person. And, you see these people in life who have an extra gear that the average person doesn't have. Well, Drazen was blessed with that. And there was, as I said, a lot of meaning to his workouts. And he was very determined from a very young age to be the best he could be. And he certainly was on his way. But I don't know where the motivation to be the first great European came from, or to make the NBA, or to be in America. Where that came from, no one was able to say. And maybe if Drazen was alive today, he might be able to articulate it. But a very special motivation he had, and it was evident early on.
You wrote that he really had to work at the game to become as good as he was. In other words, look, there had to be some God-given talent there, but he really had to work hard to refine that. Was there God-given talent there, or did it all come from hard work, I guess is my question.
Yeah. I've thought about that often because Drazen, if you look at his contemporaries, Tony Kukoc was 6'10" and could run and was a terrific athlete. I'm not sure that I'd consider Drazen, your prototypical terrific athlete. Yes, he was tall. He was 6'5", but Drazen, I think his greatest asset was his motivation, was his work ethic, was his determination. Those things, they may not be outwardly present in a physical sense, but his God-given ability, so to speak, was his, unrelenting motivation or unrelenting pursuit of excellence. And, you look at, as I mentioned, his contemporaries, Kukoc, Raja, Vlade Divac, all very successful players, but their overriding characteristic is not this mental approach that Drazen had. And I think that's what separated him from his contemporaries, as I said. And that was his greatest asset, in my opinion.
And he had that work ethic throughout his entire career, all the way up till, the tragedy.
Well, he even, his desire to represent his country, Croatia, in a tournament that was effectively meaningless, is actually why he was in Poland in June of 1993, which is, the series of events that led to the accident that took his life. So he wasn't even healthy in that particular tournament. So yes, completely agree. That's, his greatest trait was his determination, and there's absolutely no other explanation as to why he was as successful as he was.
He advanced pretty quickly too. He worked hard. He loved the game, and his talent became evident pretty quickly. And he started to play on older division teams, and he caught the eyes of great Yugoslavian coaches and players. Talk about his quick ascent, how quickly people noticed his talent and said, if he's only going to play with the 12-year-olds, he's not going to get any better. We need to move him up to the 13 and 14-year-olds. And this continued throughout his junior career.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we see now with Luka Doncic the amount of recognition given to his advanced ability as a young age, and tracing it back to, his early teen years where he was exposed to greater competition against older people. Drazen's rise was exactly the same, to the point where in 1983, he was playing for Sibenik in his hometown in the Yugoslavian competition, which is the strongest in Europe at the time, was the strongest in Europe. And he led them to, the championship game, which obviously resulted in a dubious result. But the fact that he was among the best players in Europe, even at his mid to late teens, speaks to sort of the advanced degree that he was playing at. He first represented the Yugoslavian national team in 1981 on a tour of American colleges. And he was born in October of 64, so he would have been just 17 at that age. So, yeah, advanced at a very young age, but as you mentioned, identified by the right people. As I mentioned before, Yugoslavian basketball at that time was very, very healthy. And he was identified by the right people and put in the right situations to succeed.
Before we go any further, why don't we talk about Drazen off the court? What kind of person was he, on a personal level? Was he friendly? Was he a good student? What was life like for Drazen Petrovic?
Yeah, that's something, the initial stages of researching the book, it was all about basketball. Drazen's life was basketball. And I tried to peel back the layers a little bit on his personality, but there was, outside of basketball, there was not a great deal to report. People were telling me he loved Fanta, like he loved drinking the orange soda, or, like he had, like a particular a girlfriend, Renata, who he was very close with. But, he was a very friendly person and a very generous person, but there was not a whole lot to him outside of basketball. It's funny, I'll give you a quick story. When I visited Drazen's mother in Zagreb in 2016, she told me a story that a gentleman came in to the museum, the Petrovic Museum, in the early 2010s. Drazen had lent him money in the 1980s, lent him money to go to medical school. None of Drazen's family knew this, and he'd gone on to become a doctor, and he had come back to repay the money to the family. Drazen's mother didn't know who he was, didn't know anything about his story, but Drazen had, obviously this gentleman was not in a position to go to medical school. Drazen had financed that dream of his. So he was a generous person. Of all his friends that I spoke to, loved to laugh. He was, loved to go out and eat. He had his spots in and around New York City and around the New Jersey, the East Rutherford area that he liked to frequent. Not a party guy though, not a guy that would go out drinking or anything of that nature. He was very much focused on his goals in life. Never got married. He was in a long-term relationship until about 1991. And the idea of marriage was something he wasn't ready to go into yet. So that relationship ended. But
because of his dedication to basketball.
Yeah, absolutely. The goal was his life. And that's what he was dedicated to. So, yeah, a friendly, generous person, but very much a goal-oriented and motivated, driven person.
It's funny you talk about the person who came to pay back for medical school, because what I wanted to ask you was, and I found this really surprising, that someone who could sink a basket from downtown like Drazen could, he had somewhat of a disability growing up, did he not? He had problems with his legs and his hips, and he had to overcome that. Talk about that.
Yeah, he did. It was an issue from birth where it was an alignment issue. And yeah, through the first two to 3 years of his life, there was some risk of long-term damage. They did correct the issue, and it's not particularly uncommon in children, a little bit of a widening of the hips. But even if you look at vision of Drazen later in life, he did his right leg. maybe did not bend as easy as his left. If you watch, there's sort of an interesting gait to the way that he walks. But yes, not dissimilar to Reggie Miller, who also had braces on his legs until the age of 5. Drazen, was subject to this. It was described to me as like a plaster cast that would go around his hips, and that was on for a period of months in order to correct the alignment issue. But yeah, it was something he overcame, and it was overcome at a very early age. But one of those footnotes to history that obviously could have changed his course.
Take us through his routine. He practiced, it seems like, every single chance he could get. Mornings, afternoons, evenings. And these were not easy practices. He really pushed himself. Take us through his routine, especially in his younger years, to get good enough to play at the levels he did.
Yeah, so, Drazen, as I mentioned earlier, was very regimented in his workouts, and a lot of that was, placing chairs on the floor or, dribbling around them, using chairs as screens, coming off screens, throwing the ball out in front of him, curling around a chair, shooting. All of that was very regimented. As he got older, there was a little more sophistication to them. I remember being told when he was at Real Madrid, he would wear a vest that was laced with all these little plates, like weight, and he would shoot jump shot after jump shot with those plates around almost strapped to him. Another instance of his dedication was his family visited him in Spain to bring in the new year for 1989, 88, 89. And instead of going out with them on New Year's Eve, he spent the evening in the gym. So that's the level of dedication that he was at. But, one interesting thing, Warren, that I realised in researching the book, when Drazen played in Europe, all of his workouts, all of his, work towards his game was off the dribble. And a lot of his movement started from the top of the key, everything off the dribble into the jump shot. When he got to the NBA, he had to train himself to be a spot-up shooter. We all think of Drazen as this, all-time shooter, which he was, as a spot-up shooter. And very rarely when he was in the NBA did he get much off the dribble. Well, he completely changed his workouts when he got to America, realizing that, I can't get off the dribble anymore.
And he can't put the ball on the floor. He couldn't put the ball on the floor.
Correct, yeah. Incredibly evident in the 1990 finals when you see Detroit's, guards, Isaiah Thomas, Joe Dumars, Vinnie Johnson, made it very hard for Drazen, to do anything really. And, that was a motivating factor in I've got to learn how to shoot off the catch. Those workouts were rebuilt to tailor the only way he was going to succeed in the NBA.
Yeah, so he was able to adjust his game throughout his career, and to do that, the dedication that he needed in practice with the team and, again, on his own whenever he could. I mean, he was very regimented, again, dedicated, had a passion just to be the best he could possibly be.
And the self-analysis is another thing. Obviously scouting today is very different, and the level of detail given towards the craft now is at an all-time high. Well, Drazen was just as analytical, in a different era, always looking at ways to improve his game, large video library that he would access of his own games, but constantly seeking ways to get better and improve. And that was evident, as we've discussed, in the way that he changed his game.
So back to the court here, still in Yugoslavia, he's building himself quite a resume. And he helped his, I'm going to mess it up again, Sibenik?
Sibenik. Yep.
Sibenik. He helped the Sibenik team to a surprising run at a championship, one that they lost, then won, then lost again. So first, talk about the type of player he was in Yugoslavia. What were his strengths and weaknesses? And then tell us about that championship they did win, and the one they lost controversially to Bosnia.
Yeah, it's a great story. But to answer the first part of your question, he was Sibenik was a very relatively new team to the Yugoslavian League. They had been in a second-tier competition until 1979. But right around the time Drazen joined the team at the age of 15, they were elevated to the first league. And, he was on a team that had veteran players, including Dario Saric's father, in fact, was a teammate of Drazen's. It was a team that had never won anything, and they were, Drazen was in a position where he could play and develop and grow. As I mentioned before, a lot of his movements were off the dribble. That was the sort of the origins of his game, so to speak, on the offensive end of the floor. But, watching film of Drazen at that period of time, what a confident young man he was. You hesitate to use the word because of the negative connotation, but he was cocky and he was brash and he was, the confidence just was so evident. And what resulted was, this dramatic improvement. And he averaged about 20 points a game in 1983 in the Yugoslavian League competition. Sibenik made the final, as you mentioned, and played Bosnia. The third and decisive game was played at a place called Baldecan Hall, which is where Drazen grew up, where, it was a short walk from his house. It's where, the famed workouts that we've discussed took place. And sure enough, they had an opportunity to win the Yugoslavian League title on his home floor. They were down 82-81, I believe the score was, when Drazen took a last-second shot, which he actually missed. It was contested. And, fans Bosnia, believing they had won the game, the clock had expired, sort of started celebrating. An official made a decision to call a foul, and it was, at least 30 to 45 seconds after the final buzzer, which, you think about it now would never happen. Drazen's coach actually...
Except in the 72 Olympics between the U.S. and the USSR.
Yeah, that's right. And some people are not even over that yet, which I don't blame them. But, that Drazen's coach, foreseeing a potential problem, actually said to Drazen, make one of two. Let's go to overtime and let's win it in a fair way. Let's win it properly. And even he did not believe it was a foul. Drazen looked his coach in the eye and said, I'll make both. I want to win the title. And, he's an 18-year-old kid telling his coach that. And sure enough, he made both. And it wasn't until the next day that a ruling was made that the victory, was null and void. But not only that, they were going to have to replay the game. Well, yeah, sure enough, the game, they, went to replay it the following week, and Sibenik did not show up for the game. So, yeah, they were not awarded the title, but that game deserves its own documentary because, what a wild finish.
One of the things that Drazen had to do, it's not something that we need to do here in the U.S., he had to go on and fulfill military obligation living in Yugoslavia. Now, I'm sure there were some rough times for him, but overall, he was afforded every opportunity to play for his country and to work on his game. Talk about that. Talk about, I guess, preferential treatment.
Yeah, and, we're talking – so Drazen went into the Army for the 1983-84 season. So we're talking about – we've just talked about the Bosnia game. Drazen's obviously – one of the premier guards in Yugoslavia. And yes, off the heels of that, he goes into service. You are right. He was afforded preferential treatment in the sense that he had unlimited access to a gymnasium. He was able to work on his game. And I actually found some sound bites where Drazen credited that year of his life to improving the range on his jump shot, beg your pardon. I spoke to one of his late future teammates, a gentleman named Vladimir Petrovic, who was in the Army with Drazen at that period of time. And And yeah, he said Drazen was maniacal in that particular year, just fulfilling his service obligations in the morning and then spending afternoon and evenings in the gymnasium working on his game. And the only time one of the few times he left base was actually to come to the United States in November of '83 to tour US colleges with the Yugoslavian national team. And it was there that he signed a letter of intent to go to Notre Dame. So, his future was very much a source of interest for the general public and not to mention the basketball community. So, yeah, he had to fulfill his year of service, but he also made it work for him.
Yeah, Notre Dame, Digger Phelps, who wrote the foreword to your book, he saw something in Drazen, and he then took some trips to Yugoslavia and told Drazen how much he wanted him. He wanted him to come to Notre Dame, but ultimately Drazen decided to stay home. So talk about Digger's fascination with Drazen Petrovic and why Drazen opted to stay home instead of going to Notre Dame.
Yeah, it's interesting. I became aware of the Notre Dame connection to Drazen very early on in the research project. But one question I had was, why was Digger Phelps there? Why, how did he end up in Yugoslavia? Why was he even, conducting clinics there in the first place? And a big trend throughout the 60s and 70s was American coaches, collegiate coaches, going to Europe and spreading the word, spreading the game, so to speak. They were the undisputed, the masters of basketball. And the European coaches were just, looking to develop the game. And you can see the early, plantation of seeds for, the growth of the game in Europe through these clinics, techniques on offense and defense. So that's how Digger Phelps got to Europe. He was in Sibenik in 1980, and that's when he first saw Drazen. And, he stood out for reasons that we've spoken about earlier. He was advanced for his age. His skill, his techniques were all very, very sound. And then, in 1981, 1982, so on, Drazen would tour America every November with the Yugoslavian team. And that's where the interest came from. Digger Phelps, offered, he gave Drazen a visit to Notre Dame in '83, had him sign a letter of intent, even followed up prior to the Olympics, to ensure that Drazen was going to come. Eventually Drazen did not come. It would mean, foregoing, certain obligations in Europe to play basketball in America. But I do often wonder, you look at Detlef Schrempf, who, grew up alongside Drazen. They played at junior tournaments against each other. He went to high school in, Washington State, and then went to, played at the NCAA level. And he was never thought of as a European in the traditional sense that, he had earned his merit at, in the American, system.
I remember him at the University of Washington.
Yeah, and he, 8th pick in the draft in '85, and he was validated, for lack of a better term. And I wonder how Drazen's path would have followed if he had have gone to Notre Dame. And Digger Phelps was very excited about the potential of having him there. So he was certainly good enough to play at the Division I level, and it was just it never happened. And Drazen continued in Europe. But that's one of the things I wanted to get to the bottom of. How did it come about that he was being scouted or being observed in the first place, and why he didn't go? And yeah, it was an interesting portion of the book.
Mm-hmm. So he stays home. He plays in Europe. He goes to the national team, continues to make a name for himself. He wins scoring titles and championships, and ultimately he goes on to play for Real Madrid. Now, I know I'm jumping around a little bit. We can't cover every single detail in your book. We got to get people out there to buy the book, right?
Absolutely.
But now this is around the time that Drazen really catches the attention of the NBA. So a few questions here. First, talk about Drazen's career in Yugoslavia and how, I guess, he might have been the one to actually open the doors for guys like Vlade Divac and Dino Raja and Tony Kukoc, because they saw that there are Europeans who have the talent to play in the game, and that was based off of how good Drazen was.
Yeah, that's right. And, Europeans had played collegiate basketball in America, but and some had even been drafted. Kresimir Ćosić, who I mentioned earlier, a Croatian, was drafted in the early 70s by both Portland and the Lakers in consecutive years. So, but the difference was it was never entertained. The idea was never truly entertained that, an international player or a European player is going to go to the NBA. That would mean relinquishing national team obligations and, representing their country at a greater level. So the NBA was never truly a consideration until Drazen and then Arvydas Sabonis were both drafted by Portland in 86. Portland actually used a first-round pick on Sabonis in 86. He'd been drafted the year before also by Atlanta. So it was around that time that the momentum was building where someone was going to do this. Someone was going to go to America and be successful. I mentioned two players earlier. Georgi Gluchkov played with Phoenix in 85, 86, and then another player, Fernando Martin, played with Portland in 86, 87. Neither of them were successful. The language barrier was a problem. Adjusting to the daily grind of the NBA was a problem. There was all these little infractions where it just wasn't going to work. By the time Drazen was emerging, and as you mentioned, very successful in Europe, with Cibona, based in Zagreb in Croatia, they won 2 European Cups. They won a domestic title. He gradually moved to Real Madrid, which was, something of basketball royalty in the Spanish league. And that was seen as another gradual step towards the NBA. As I mentioned, Portland had his draft rights. He didn't go over in 86. He didn't go over in 87. Portland approached him after the Olympics in 88 to see if he was going to come. And it wasn't until 1989 that sort of, a series of events led to him ultimately deciding to go to the NBA. It was always there. It was always a vision in his mind, but there was some trepidation. As I mentioned, players had failed. So there was some hesitation, but really it was Drazen and Sarunas Marciulionis and then Divac as well, going to the NBA in 89, that really paved the way and really need to be credited as the first wave of players to really make that stand.
Now you talk about Sabonis, you talk about Vlade Divac and Tony Kukoc and a couple of the other guys. How much better or just how good was, in comparison, Drazen Petrovic? How much better was he than the competition he was facing on a daily basis?
Yeah, gosh, that's a good question. Drazen played in a when in Europe in the 80s, you would win your domestic competition. You would play in something called the European Cup, and that's where he was playing against Sabonis and Fernando Martin and other great players in Europe. That was the best competition, the ultimate competition. Drazen, no matter where he played or what level, he was getting his points. But if you compare him not against those players but against the average players, there was a great difference. European players were good, but Drazen was certainly on a different level. He was certainly even a standout from a young age. Was, as we've talked about, the fact that he was drafted by an American team obviously signified just how great that difference was. But the other thing is he was the only guard at that period of time. Marciulionis didn't sort of come about until about 87 when he started appearing more on national teams, and he was particularly good at the European Championships in 87. So his announcement of arrival came a little bit after Drazen's. So Drazen was really the first guard in Europe to make himself known on a world scale and to be considered for the NBA. And I think that's the biggest differentiation when discussing him with the Sabonises, the Divac, Kukoc, Raja, much bigger players and much more certain, for lack of a better term.
Now, to get to the NBA, he had to work at something else, something called the 28-year-old rule.
Yep.
Can you tell us what that was and how he got that rule to change?
Yeah, that was one thing that I was really interested in when researching the book. There was rules in place at the time that prohibited players from leaving their native country to go to, say, another country within Europe to then make money, or, make a living, a suitable living. Yugoslavian basketball, yes, healthy, as I've mentioned, but there was money to be made in the Italian league, which actually housed, a number of former NBA players, including, Joe Bryant, Kobe's father. You had Spain. There were players there who were making money. So in Yugoslavia, they introduced a rule where there was previously a rule where you couldn't leave your native country until you were 28 years old or had played X amount of games for the national team. Well, when Drazen signed a contract with Real Madrid in the mid-1980s, at risk of losing, their greatest export or having a bad relationship with Drazen, that rule was relaxed. That rule was effectively rewritten to allow Drazen to go to Real Madrid at the age of 24. He went to Spain, and that you think about Drazen in 1988. He'd been part of the scene for so long, but he was still only 24 years of age. So he deemed that the right time to go to Spain. It was a very profitable contract, and that was once again the stepping stone to that end goal, which was the NBA.
And when he got to Real Madrid, it wasn't clear-cut that was a team he was going to go play for in Spain. If I remember correctly, there was a little battle for his services. And when he finally did get to Real Madrid, I guess the impression I got is that the players didn't really accept him, despite the fact that he made them such a better team.
Yeah, you're correct on both accounts. Drazen actually entertained offers from Barcelona as well as Real Madrid. And I even found newspaper reports where he had signed with Barcelona. That was never authenticated through my research, but there were rumours that, and he was obviously using the two clubs to leverage against each other. But as far as acceptance, that was very difficult for Drazen. He had a very strong history playing against Spanish domestic clubs in various competitions, but also against the Spanish national team. There was even an incident. So he signed the contract with Real Madrid in 1986. There was a tournament that summer where he actually spat on a referee, which is obviously not very nice behaviour. But they were the sort of things that happened in games versus Spain, and there was a very heated rivalry with particular players in Spain. When Drazen got to Real Madrid for the 88-89 season, it was like an outsider was being brought in. Real Madrid was a successful team. They didn't, what do we need this guy for? And, obviously with the history, it was very hard for Drazen to fit in. He was almost reclusive for that period of time that he was in Madrid. And even though the team was successful and they did win important games, they didn't win the Spanish League title that year. They did lose to Barcelona, coincidentally. But it was a challenging year for Drazen, fitting in. But once again, it was all the fixation on the end goal was, I need this to progress, and he was willing to put up with whatever issues came along the way.
Right. So, and as you said earlier, he was drafted in 1986. Somehow Portland, Buck Walter, he caught the eye of Bucky. Portland drafts him in 1986. Doesn't go to Portland right away, as you had discussed. And he had to really work at leaving Europe to get to Portland. He wanted to improve his game. He wanted to go there prepared. He had to get that 28-year-old rule changed. And then there were contracts and court cases and who had jurisdiction. There was a lot of legal maneuvering. How did it all go down? Please explain what happened.
This was really hard to not only research but write about, and it was cross-checking with Drazen's agent. He had a Spanish agent. He had Warren Ligari, who would be his NBA agent during his NBA years. And he also had an attorney in Portland, a gentleman named Nicholas Goyak, who was a wonderful gentleman who recently passed away, who was very close with Drazen, and he helped navigate that legal maze, really. Drazen was contractually obligated to Real Madrid. He had a multi-year deal. He only played there one season, and then in 1989, when it became apparent that, first of all, American, professionals were going to be playing in the Olympics. So as a result of that, that meant, national team players from other countries could also play in the NBA now and not relinquish those. So, Vladi was drafted by the Lakers in 89. Marciulionis signed a contract with the Warriors in 89. All those people, those players were heading over there, and Drazen, wanting to be part of that revolution, wanting to be in the NBA, also decided that he was going to cash in on his opportunity to play with Portland. He was going to make that happen. Effectively, Real Madrid said, we're not letting you out of this contract. The best player in Europe, we're not letting him go. And what actually happened was, it was in the middle of the night. His American agent took he and his girlfriend to the airport. They flew out of Spain. They arrived in Portland the next day. Drazen left a note in his apartment in Madrid, basically saying what he had done. He knew that someone would go look for him, and Portland had sent representatives to Madrid, in the prior months, trying to gauge Drazen's interest. He was desperate to go to America all of a sudden and test his abilities in the NBA, but the fact that he was contractually obligated, the fact that he was, effectively tied to Madrid made that difficult. They made it work. Portland obviously hired some powerful representatives. Drazen had this massive legal team back in Portland, and what resulted was they gave him, effectively his rights to play for Portland. And, he ended up being in the NBA for 89-90. But it was not an easy thing. It was not a situation where you simply sign a contract. Drazen, as I mentioned, he was tied to Madrid, and they made it so that, he was able to go to the NBA.
And when he got to the NBA, it wasn't that easy either. I mean, he ended up with a really good team, the Portland Trailblazers. And actually, I was at the finals that year between Portland and Detroit. Just a side note, I was. I went to a couple of the games in Detroit. The Trailblazers had a really good team. I mean, they had Clyde Drexler and Terry Porter. They were a real contender for the NBA championship. It had to be disappointing for Drazen. Sure, he goes on and plays in the NBA Finals, but their coach at that time, Rick Adelman, he wasn't sure what to do with Drazen based on the fact that European players really didn't have much of a track record in the NBA. And add to the fact that when Drazen got there, he was hurt. It wasn't what Drazen expected when he got to Portland, was it?
No, it certainly wasn't. And you made a very important point there. The track record was not there. Europeans were an unknown quantity. And also you're right. Drazen arrived in Portland with a back problem. He had a cyst in his lower back that needed to be surgically removed. So he was not completely healthy. He missed training camp. He was behind two all-star players. Drexler, one of the greatest to ever play his position. There was always going to be a limitation on the minutes that were available. And this team was very different to the one that had drafted him in 1986. All those players, maybe not Drexler, he was already an all-star in 86, but Porter, small school, Kersey, small school, Duckworth, small school, they later added Buck Williams. This team had grown and developed over time. By 1989, they were very, very firmly set for a run in what resulted was 2 finals appearances. But, an interesting story that kind of sums up the mindset. There was at least 2 Portland beat writers who told me that, they would get calls from European journalists, asking why Drazen wasn't playing. They just could not wrap their minds around the fact that their best player, was playing 12 to 15 minutes in Portland, couldn't understand it. Drazen couldn't understand it. He had this unwavering belief, and obviously justified by his later performance. But I came to reconcile that Portland was a necessary step in Drazen's development at the NBA level. It was, if he had have got, maybe ended up on an expansion team or a bad team, maybe things turned out differently. Portland was a necessary, it was a message. It was a realization that, this is what it requires to play at this level, to be successful. And I, came to believe that that was something that needed to take place in order for Drazen to then proceed and develop.
In your book, The Mozart of Basketball, you wrote that when Drazen did get to the NBA, he realized, as you were just talking about, just how much better the competition was as opposed to Europe, and he had to change some of his game. And we talked about that. He could no longer put the ball on the floor. How long did it take Drazen to adjust to the game in the NBA?
I began reading, obviously through game recaps, and you pick up little nuggets here and there. And obviously Drazen was a curiosity. He was new. He was from Europe, so there was good coverage on his game. And the biggest thing, the overwhelming thing that stood out was he was having a lot of difficulty putting the ball on the floor, and that survived all through that first season. There were gradual changes to his game as the season wore on, but even after that rookie season, Drazen stayed in Portland over the summer. They scrimmaged against the Team USA that played in the World Championships in 1990, a team that had future NBA players on it. And Drazen was forced to play point guard in one of those scrimmages and had a terrible time. It was a real issue for Drazen that first year in the NBA to adjust. As you mentioned, he couldn't put the ball on the floor. It was the movements that he was able to make in Europe simply weren't there in America. So I would say that adjustment period was all through that first season. Of course, by year 2, Danny Ainge has arrived. So whatever changes Drazen's made, he's not able to implement in Portland during that first half of that 90-91 season. But yeah, the rookie season was an adjustment period. He had some games, successful games, good performances when he got minutes. I know Drexler missed some games in February. Drazen had some breakout games on an East Coast swing. But that first season was really hard for Drazen. And as I mentioned, it was a necessary thing. I've come to realize. I would love to ask him if he was still alive. I would love to ask him what his memories are of that year in Portland, because, we all focus on he wasn't playing, what a struggle it was. Personally, it was really hard for Drazen to accept. I would love to know what he would, looking back on that period of time, how he would feel about it, and whether he feels the same way I do, that it was something that he had to endure.
You said that they got Danny Ainge, and that first year was, it was tough. It was necessary. But the second year wasn't much better because they did get Danny Ainge, and Drazen was further down the bench. And this really upset him. This was not what he thought he was getting into. And ultimately, he requested a trade. Why did Rick Adelman give up on him so quickly?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and you may even need to look at it differently. Why did Drazen give up on Portland? Would perhaps be better.
Well, that's a good idea. Yeah.
Well, to answer that question, the fingerprints on this particular situation come from Warren Ligari, Drazen's agent, who, for better or worse, he loved Drazen, man. He just loved him, really, really had a good relationship with Drazen, and it really cut him up to see Drazen struggling emotionally. Drazen as confident as he was during this period of time in his life and in his career, he was considering going back to Europe, especially that second season when the minutes completely dried up. And Warren Ligari really thought, I've got to rescue Drazen from this situation. And he is the one that suggested the trade demand. Drazen went to Jeff Petrie, an all-time great with the Blazers in their early days, who was in the front office, and requested a trade. The team fined him and then rescinded that fine. It was a really messy situation. Rick Adelman actually kept a diary, a book. He wrote a book that particular season. I've got it here in my office, actually. It's called The Long Hot Winter. And he wrote about Drazen in that and what a distraction that was. The team started off so well, and Drazen's trade demand came at was really seen as a distraction, as a bad thing. He even wrote later that he, in that same book, that he didn't think Drazen would ever be a star in the NBA. This was just a marginal player, that's making these demands as if he's something more. So it was a tough situation for Drazen, but really motivated by his agent, who wanted him to succeed and who believed he could succeed. So that was really where that trade demand came from. But the second season, it was a real problem. He just simply wasn't playing at all. Whatever minutes he was getting as a rookie were effectively gone in that second year, and something had to change.
And what changed was he was traded to New Jersey. And really, I think this was the best thing that could have ever happened for Drazen. But he still had to overcome a couple of obstacles. And before he could become the star of the team, again, he actually considered giving up and going back home. How trying was the first few months with the Nets? What was going on? And again, why was he considering going back home? I mean, I guess Bill Fitch being your coach is a pretty tough thing.
Yeah, to say the least. It's, there was a drill sergeant somewhere in his DNA, maybe even his father, Bill Fitch, I believe. But, if you look at the statistics, if you go to Drazen's, statistics, you would say, oh, you know what? He got to New Jersey, things got better, happily ever after. It wasn't the case at all. Like Drazen,
not at all.
First of all, Willis Reed, who I did not speak to in the book, and believe me, I tried and would have been great. He gave up a first-round draft pick for Drazen. You think about that. That was a pretty gutsy thing to do, because Drazen was still, a year and a half into his career. We still really didn't know where he was at, what his potential was. Could he be successful in the NBA? Willis Reed gave up a first-round draft pick. Drazen goes to New Jersey, which is not a successful team. They hadn't been successful really since they came across from the ABA. And the minutes were there, played about 20 minutes a game, averaged about 12 points a game in that half season. But he was miserable. Drazen was really, really miserable. Bill Fitch was particularly hard on him. And I did speak to Fitch for the book. It's funny. We're in this analytics era of basketball currently, where statistics are everything. Fitch actually told me about a statistical report that he used to get from one of Pete Newell's sons. And
yeah, I read about this. Yeah,
that Drazen would appear, for his efficiency, for playing this short amount of time, and what productivity he brought. And that was also a key reason why the Nets got him. So despite all of that, Fitch was very difficult for Drazen to work with initially. And maybe Fitch saw something in Drazen. Maybe he was testing him, I don't know. But Drazen did consider going back to Europe and almost got to the point where he didn't unpack in New Jersey. It was a period of time before he did get his belongings out of boxes from Portland and settle in. But once he did, he was off and running. But once again, that first hurdle to cross in New Jersey was probably the hardest.
Well, what was the turning point? And again, what adjustments did he have to make in his game to fit in with the New Jersey Nets?
Yeah, well, we keep coming back to this theme. It's all about adjustment. Like, Drazen was never settled in the NBA. It's always got to be something. The next, what have I got to add to my game? How, I'm not getting minutes. How do I get minutes? It was always what's in front of me, and that's really the theme, not only for his NBA career but for his life. A couple of important things happened. Drazen got minutes in that half season in New Jersey. Reggie Theus left. He was one of the starting guards, and he left at the end of the 91 season. Drazen also, for the first time in his adult life in 1991, he did not participate in anything related to the Yugoslavian national team. Part of the reason for that was, obviously his desire to improve his career, but also because of the turmoil going on in Yugoslavia during that period of time. Drazen was sensitive to those issues and decided that he would stay in America during that off season. So, things were aligning where Drazen was going to get minutes for the 91-92 season, and he felt staying in America was going to, during that off season was going to enhance those opportunities, and that proved correct. So series of events led to 91-92, and he finds himself as a starting guard in the NBA.
Yeah, with a pretty good team, Derek Coleman and Kenny Anderson. I mean, they had a really good team. You just touched upon something that we really haven't discussed in depth, and that is the situation back home. Croatia wanted to secede from Yugoslavia, and that's where Drazen was from, Croatia. And that was a big deal, especially for guys like Drazen and Stojko Vrankovic, who was playing for the Celtics at that time. That had to be a real heavy burden on them. How did that affect them? And, of course, when you consider a guy like Vlade Divac, who Drazen and he were good friends, but now Vlade's on the other side of the conflict. That's got to put another type of strain on Drazen. I'm not sure we're, meaning Americans, are capable of understanding the mental aspect of such a situation. Talk about that. Talk about the distraction. And I guess that's really an awful word to use, distraction, when all this is happening back home. But mentally, basketball, he's got to be great at. He's got this situation back home. He's losing people that were his friends because now they're being split up because of what side of the line they're on. Man, that's a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah, and even just unpacking all of those issues was something I found very intimidating. I'm not even going to pretend that I understand what that was like, or, even writing about it. There is some fear that perhaps I'm going to write something or misinterpret it, or, what means something, something means something to one person may mean something else to another. Even just the term, civil war, a Croatian said it's not a civil war. Civil war implies that both sides are fighting. It's like, we're protecting ourselves, we're being attacked. And it's like, gosh, how do I tackle this? But one question I would ask of those closest to Drazen was, was it a big part of his life? Did it define him in any way? And obviously things have been written, things have been said that, his relationship with Vlade, obviously it did deteriorate, but, how did that come about? Well, obviously it was for issues that were bigger than them, greater than them. Drazen, I found clips even after this particular war was taking place where Drazen was very complimentary of Vlade and of his game. So, yes, the friendship was spoiled. It was made it difficult to continue contact. But there was that history there where they had played together for a long time from the middle part of the 80s through. Those things still meant something to Drazen. But the war, the issues in Yugoslavia, I don't even know what to call it. Those things, were important. Independence was important to Drazen. Croatian independence. He was involved in several rallies in and around New York City just to lend his support. Obviously being one of the bigger name athletes in Croatia, representing Croatia at some stage was important to him. But as far as being a zealot for the war cause, like that wasn't really Drazen. Yes, he was passionate about it. Yes, he was concerned about it. But at the same time, he was very, very driven to be successful in his career, and that's where a lot of his emotion lie.
Mm-hmm. Well, back to basketball. After all, that's what we're talking about. 1992, the Olympics, Barcelona. Now, this is when the U.S. decided to field probably the most famous and strongest basketball team in international play history, the Dream Team. But despite all that was happening back home for Drazen, Croatia also entered the Olympics, and it fielded one heck of a team. Drazen, Toni Kukoc, Dino Raja, Stojko Vrankovic. Of course, Drazen believed he could beat anyone. What a great feeling. But beating the U.S. was a virtual impossibility. So really, the competition was for the silver medal. How did Croatia do, and what did fielding a team mean for the people back home in Croatia?
Yeah, it was an incredible source of pride for Croatia. They only gained their independence in late 1991, some 6-7 months before the Olympics. And they were only really approved for Olympic competition in January of 92. So it all came together very quickly. Spoke to several members of that Olympic team, and just the pride was so evident, being the first, group to represent Croatia, especially during that period of time, just pride. Drazen set the tone in training camp, in May, June of 92, obviously with his standing in world basketball, but also with his approach and just his determination. It really came through. I really enjoyed watching those games back during the research process, just how passionate he was about playing for Croatia, and the tears streaming down his face when they advanced to the gold medal game, because, that, as you mentioned, it was impossible to, and it was never going to happen where another team was going to take gold other than the American team. But just the tears streaming down Drazen's face when they won the game that got them into the gold medal game really says it all, and a medal wasn't assured, even with all that talent, just because of how quickly everything had come together. Obviously, the things going on back home, but just immense pride in representing Croatia. That was just the overwhelming trait that came through, when looking at Drazen's time. And kind of hard to believe, he was a leading scorer in the gold medal game, and he was in the last 12 months of his life. That's really hard to believe, probably his greatest basketball moment. And he was so, no one knew it at the time, but it was so close to the end. It's just a real tragic irony.
Sure. And we're going to get there momentarily, but meanwhile, back in the U.S., the Nets and Bill Fitch parted ways, and New Jersey hired Chuck Daly. How big was that for Drazen? What did Daly and his assistant, Brendan Scherer, see in Drazen Petrovic? I mean, like you said, just, what a tragedy. This tragedy is about to happen. And one of the saddest things about it is he's finally got a coach who really believes in him. And, yeah, wow. I mean, what did Daly see in him? And how did his game turn?
Yeah, it's amazing how the planets aligned. Daly's coaching the Dream Team. They played against Croatia twice in the Barcelona Olympics. He's already signed to be, the coach of the Nets, and all these things are in place where he's got this front row view of Drazen. And, he'd coached against Drazen in the 1990 finals, as we've talked about. He was obviously aware of Drazen's path, but as Drazen had grown in his game, proven himself at the NBA level, I think Daly was very much invested, in Drazen's success. You talked about Brendan Scherer. Also, Rick Carlisle was a young assistant in that net. There were people around Drazen at that time who were there to sort of escort him into that next level that Drazen wanted to get to. So the 92-93 season was really this coming together of, the Nets were finally, they had someone to lead them that was a legitimate, Daly's one of the greatest coaches the league has ever seen. He had all this young talent around him, this potential. Finally, they had something to be excited about, and Drazen was at the forefront of that. He had a terrific season, and Daly was, a big reason for that. Daly was famous in Detroit for coaching the hot hand. If a player was hot, he would get the ball the next time down the floor, and then the next time. And that's really what happened to Drazen that year. He was given more opportunities to develop his game even further. I know they used to run a side pick and roll with Drazen and one of the bigs on the Nets. And Drazen's there putting the ball on the floor again, and it was almost like, he had graduated to that level where he could once again put the ball on the floor. And so his offensive game was not done growing yet. And, and I attribute that to Daly's arrival.
So in New Jersey, in 91-92, he averaged 20.1 points per game. He scored over 24 per game in the playoffs, or just about 24. 92-93, he averaged 21.2 points per game, and he really became the focal point of the Nets. He thought he should have been an all-star that year too. But he was snubbed, and he used that snub as motivation to lead the Nets into the playoffs, a really tough 5-game series, which they lost to Cleveland. Just how good was Drazen Petrovic? And New Jersey was really a team on the rise at this point, and a lot of it had to do with Drazen.
They were on pace to win 50 games in that particular season, but Kenny Anderson broke his wrist right at the end of February, and then Drazen suffered a knee injury late in March. And really, Drazen should have been done for the year, but he did make his way back. He'd torn ligaments in his knee and did get back before the playoffs, but wasn't quite the same. That team was really good. And in watching game films back, years later, really nice balance to the team. They had Coleman was a really nice power forward. Kenny Anderson was a developing point guard. They had good shooting around them, obviously, with Drazen. Obviously well coached, like we've talked about. Like, this was a team that was ready to take the next step. As I said, they were on pace to win 50 games, but injuries, they fell short. Once again, they made the playoffs. Drazen had a terrific year. He had a career high in January against Houston. He scored 44 points. Really, he scored points against everybody. He was a really consistent player that year. No doubting it, he was one of the 3 or 4 best shooting guards in the league, in the world. So his place in the game was secure. You mentioned about the All-Star berth. He didn't make the All-Star team, and that's something he felt actually had to do with his background, with being European and Europeans not being accepted. That was his belief. He had confided in people about that. But he was rewarded with an All-NBA nod, All-NBA third team, which in many ways is greater than an All-Star berth. So the validation was there from the NBA, and I think that's, sometimes obviously when you're researching something, you look at different angles, and it occurred to me, what if Drazen's accident had been after his rookie year or after his second year, or like the fact that he had that opportunity to show what he could do was a really, really cool thing. And his 4th season in New Jersey, efficiency wise, great shooting. He scored a lot of points, and his team won. Really, that's a sign of what was to come.
And by the way, the fans loved him, and he played to the fans.
Yeah, and New Jersey was not known for its vocal crowd. Like, this is he could light up an arena that had 8,000 people in it, and that's the thing about Drazen. He would involve the consumer. He would involve the fan, dragging them in, like with his emotion, the way he played. And that's another thing that always attracted me to Drazen was, when he's celebrating, you feel involved in that. That's a rare quality in a player, and that's something that started in Europe.
The sad thing about all of this is obviously what's about to happen that we're going to discuss. But he's playing so well for the Nets, and there's a contract squabble going on. And when they got eliminated by Cleveland, he said, "That's it. I'm going home. I'm done with the NBA. I'm going back to Europe." And, a lot of people believed he was, and there were others who said it's just a ploy. What do you think?
Yeah, gosh, this was the question. This was the thing. I said to myself, I'm going to find the answer to this. This is surely there is somewhere he said to someone along the way what his intentions were. So to outline the situation, in 92-93, throughout the whole season, Warren Ligari was negotiating with the Nets, and they were going back and forth on numbers. They were unable to agree, I believe, on duration of a contract, which was the sticking point. And, Drazen felt like, yes, the Nets had invested in him, but he had also invested in the Nets, and he felt that he should be rewarded, which is no different to any other player. That's fine. That sort of came to a head, as you mentioned, when they were eliminated from the playoffs. Drazen had come back early. He had played injured. He had felt that, he had sacrificed himself physically for the team. And in the post-game, he immediately just unloaded. He became very emotional, basically outlined his intentions to go back to Europe. As I mentioned, I was going to find out what exactly the story was. I did speak to Ligari about it. He was not clear on, yes, Drazen had an offer from a European team, Panathinaikos in Greece, and it was a very lucrative offer. Yes, that was there, but there was also hints that, yes, they were using that as leverage. Yes, it was something that they were going to use against the Nets' offer to perhaps get what they wanted. But I've read many media reports, some who believe, writers who are close to Drazen who believe, yes, he was going to go back to Europe. There was Drazen gave an interview with a Greek newspaper 4 days before his death, and he was very, very vague. He was saying, you know what, I'm not committing to a great contract. We're going to see how this plays out. Ligari, so Drazen was killed on a Monday. He gave this interview on a Thursday. Spoke to Ligari on the Friday, said, look, things aren't happening with the Nets. We're going to keep pushing forward and see what happens. So obviously the accident takes place and Drazen is up in the air. It's important to keep in mind he was a restricted free agent. So yes, Drazen did, think about going to other teams in the NBA. That was really not going to happen. The Nets were going to match it. But the other thing
he liked Houston. He liked Houston.
He liked Houston, and you know what? That was a really analytical thing, because playing alongside Olajuwon, you had guys like Kenny Smith and Vernon Maxwell, and they were one of the first teams to really exploit the usefulness of the three-pointer. I asked Drazen's mother when I visited Zagreb, I said, in your heart, you know Drazen better than anyone. He'd worked his whole life to get to the NBA. What do you believe he was going to do? And without a hesitation, he was going back to the NBA. There's no way he'd worked his entire life to get to the greatest league in the world. She was highly confident. Now, Drazen was his own man. He had not tipped his hat to anybody. He had not divulged what he was going to do. His mother believed in her heart that he would return to the NBA. So that was good enough for me. But that's one of those unanswered questions. And because of a sudden tragic accident, we'll never have the answer.
Yeah, and that accident, you got to wonder, had office help in New Jersey never handed over a certain phone number to Drazen Petrovic, he might not have never met the woman whom he went to go and visit. Things happen. Funny reason. I encourage everybody to read your book, the Mozart of basketball, to really dive in and see how this all develops. But after the season, tragedy strikes. This is where Drazen's story takes the most horrible turn. It can't get any worse. Literally, figuratively, cannot get any worse. What happened?
Yeah, you mentioned the note that was given to Drazen. Well, there was a call placed to the Nets offices sometime in the spring, I believe March 1993, and it was a young woman, European in background, wanting Drazen's phone number. Very, just asking point blank for Drazen's phone number. Obviously, that was not given to her, but she left her phone number. That was eventually made its way through the channels to Drazen. Young man, single, curious. He had a friend meet with this girl. Her name was Clara. Beautiful young woman, basketball background, modeling background. So naturally, there's a mutual affection between them.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one thing that was reported all throughout, and even still today, was that they were dating, that they were boyfriend and girlfriend. I can confirm that was not true. They were merely just acquaintances, attracted to one another, of course, and they did spend time together outside of, they spent private time together, let me say. So that's what the series of events that led to Drazen meeting with her in Germany. He'd actually arranged to meet her maybe, I want to say, May of 1993, and he overslept. His mother did not wake him to go catch a flight to Germany. So his mother was a little bit wary, I think, of course, wary of strangers trying to enter, Drazen's life. So they were, arranged to meet following this tournament that Drazen played in the first week of June in 93. And, one thing led to another, and she was at the wheel when a very tragic accident took place. And Drazen was asleep at the time. He was not aware of the impact. It all happened. They were driving too fast, simply put, on a road that was too wet, and ran straight into a truck. But there are many series of events that could have, obviously, you mentioned the first step was giving the phone number to Drazen, and then even his decision to not fly with the Croatian team to get off at the airport in Germany and then meet with his friend. All these decisions, even her decision to drive at the way that she was driving, in the conditions she was driving in, and we'd still have Drazen here. So, one of those tragic things that, frankly, will never be reconciled. Drazen's mother, bless her, she's has never gotten over it, and I know a lot of people close to Drazen never have and never will. So, just a tragic ending to a life that promised so much.
Todd, I reached out to you before the tragedy of Kobe Bryant. So we had been talking about doing this interview prior to that horrific accident. Obviously, Kobe, fresh in our memories. Now, on the court, I'm not comparing Kobe Bryant and Drazen, but off the court and in the basketball world, the outpouring of love and how everyone reacted is very similar. Just how big was Drazen in the NBA, Croatia, Yugoslavia, the world of basketball? His death was a big deal.
No, I'm glad you asked that, Warren. I've thought so much about Drazen since Kobe's accident, and obviously thought a lot about Kobe as well. I mean, like, it's just such a final thing. Like, it happens, and then there's that period of realization where it's actually happened. I was not old enough to remember Drazen's accident. I knew who Drazen was, and I do remember. I was only 9 years old, but there was no way I was absorbing it or understanding it at the time. But in coming to understand what he meant, you see this outpouring for Kobe, and it's an overwhelming thing. It's such a, it almost takes an accident or something of this magnitude to understand what these people mean to the masses. Well, it was very much like that for Drazen. I think I even put it into a percentage. I think it was about 4% of Croatia's population attended his funeral.
Wow!
Like think about that. Just this massive amount of people congregated in one place to celebrate Drazen. He represented so much for them. He was a source of pride. He was someone who had gone to, outside of their little bubble and had been successful. He was a basketball player, but he represented success, and he represented, someone from here can mean something over there. So, we love and adore these sports figures in our lives. They represent so much. And, Drazen was like that. And I'm seeing that now with Kobe. It's just, as I said, perhaps it has something to do with the way that they were taken away and the promise of more. And, it's like, gosh, did we appreciate them enough while they were here? Do we, all those emotions get wrapped up into it. But, yeah, it's interesting that you bring up Kobe, because one of the first things I thought about was Drazen. And, it's just such a very cruel thing, such a very cruel way to lose your life. But also, when all the signs are that you're going to offer more and achieve more, that's particularly cruel, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the only difference being Drazen was in the middle of his career. Kobe had put together a Hall of Fame career, but nonetheless, both incredibly tragic. Hey, in your research, while writing this book, what surprised you most? What did you uncover that surprised you more than anything else about Drazen?
That's a good question. I knew he was someone who, obviously you've got to have a certain level of motivation, a certain work ethic to be successful regardless of whatever industry you're involved in. But Drazen was determined to be successful. And I don't know why. Like, why was it important that he be the first European to be a star in the NBA? Like, why was it not enough just to play in the NBA? So, like, trying to find the answer to that was the most interesting thing to me. It was, why did you think the way that you did? Why did you work the way that you did? Why did you, you demand a trade from Portland? Why do you believe you're going to be successful? I just kept coming back to his mindset. That was the most surprising thing, the most interesting thing, and that's the path. You've got to ask the people that know him to try to articulate it. And in many cases, they couldn't, not even his family. So trying to find that answer was really the path that I found most interesting.
And what is the legacy of Drazen Petrovic?
Yeah, gosh, well, we've just had an all-star game that's had the most international participants. So, that's the legacy of Drazen Petrovic. You see the three-pointer as a weapon, not only a psychological weapon, but a fast track to success in the modern game. That's Drazen Petrovic. You look all around, Luka Doncic, a young European who's, was pre-packaged for stardom in the NBA, the acceptance before he's even played a game. Why do we accept European players now? Well, that's because of Drazen and the success that he had. So, yeah, most places you look, Warren, if you look around the NBA, you'll see Drazen's impact. Not only that, you see the success of international teams against the United States in international competition. That's something Drazen is on record as predicting that would happen one day. He didn't know when it would happen, but he foresaw that. So having the courage to take on the so-called masters of the sport, that's Drazen's legacy. So in most places you look in the modern game, you can see a little bit of Drazen.
Your book, The Mozart of Basketball, is such a great book, and it really dives into the type of ball player that Drazen Petrovic was, and like we've said before, the passion he had for the game, the work that he put into the game, and it's just a shame that he was taken away from us at such an early age in the prime of his career. Who knows how good he could have been. I want to thank you so much for joining me on Sports Forgotten Heroes. For you, early on a Sunday morning, I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. Todd, you working on anything else? What else can we look for from you, Todd?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me, and it's an honor to talk about Drazen, to even just be a small part of his story. It's just cool to speak about Drazen, to have the opportunity to write a book is really cool. So I'm currently working on an encyclopedia of the NBA Finals, and it's more a research-based project, but I just love diving in, and I plan on being a very big project, and I'm not sure when I'll get done, but just, love the history of the game, and it's something that, we all know about the great moments in the finals, but there's a lot of details that slip through the cracks. So this book's really going to narrow down on those details, and really excited about it. But to talk about Drazen and to be even in a minor sense attached to his story, that's something that I take a lot of pride in.
Well, Todd, again, thank you so much for joining me on Sports Forgotten Heroes, and I hope you'd consider coming back again sometime.
Thank you for having me, and that would be my pleasure. I appreciate the time, Warren. Thanks a lot.
When you look back at the life and career of Drazen Petrovic, you're left wondering just how special it could have been. He was truly a unique individual who had a passion for the game of basketball matched by so few. In fact, I can think of very few who practiced as much as he did. Kobe Bryant and the incredible Pete Maravich are two that do come to mind immediately. On the court, in his brief NBA career that spanned just 5 seasons, Petrovic averaged 15.4 points per game. But it was his final 2 years with the Nets where he finally came into his own, averaging just over 21 points a game. In 2013, Drazen was voted the best European player in history by his fellow players. He was enshrined in the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame, and his number 3 was retired by the Nets. He won numerous awards in the EuroLeagues, including Mr. Europa Star, Yugoslavian Sportsman of the Year, Croatia Sportsman of the Year, and so many more. In short, Drazen Petrovic, as evidenced by his being named one of FIBA's 50 greatest basketball players of all time, was a true superstar. A superstar NBA fans were deprived of seeing in full stride because of the horrific events that took place on June 7th, 1993. Thanks again to my guest today, Todd Spehr, and the good folks at Sports Publishing, an imprint of Sky House Publishing, for connecting me with Todd. And thanks to all of you for listening, and we'll see you next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.